Peter Anderson is the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and is in the studio to answer that question. Thank you very much for coming in. What's your immediate response to Jeff?
Well, I don't think that Jeff has the right position in this case because the economy, as the federal government reminded us last week with the budget, is very uneven. And unfortunately, this case involves not the large end of town, but the small business people who are in the slow lane of the two-speed economy. And so it really involves trying to exercise the wisdom of Solomon between two parts of the community who are doing it quite difficult at the moment.
Let's explain that a little further. You're saying it's not going to affect the big booming parts of the business. There's the miners where things are really going so well. It's the other side. That's where you're going to see the pressure.
That's right. This case only really involves businesses that employ people on the award system. And that's the small and medium businesses of Australia. Larger businesses tend to get their wages regulated through collective agreements, and that's not what this case involves. This case involves the small and medium businesses, the suburban shops, the people that employ 10, 20, 30 employees, and they're people who really aren't getting the flow-down benefits from the mining boom.
What evidence do you have that the effect on small business will be as bad as you say it will be?
What we saw last year was a record increase of $26 a week, and we did some survey work with our business members to find out exactly how they dealt with that. And we found interestingly that it didn't just cut back on their profitability and the investment money that they had for their business, but some of them, about a third of them actually, had to reduce working hours to try and make the wages still work. It was stretched too far with last year's increase. And if you do end up having to reduce the amount of hours you offer your staff, that reduces their incomes in turn. So no one really gains from a record increase. So last year was certainly on the high side. And that's what this year's decision really needs to correct. It really needs to be much more modest, much more reasonable increase.
And you're talking quite a modest rise. You're talking $9.50, which is a very big difference to the $28 at the ACCI.
It certainly is, but last year's record decision really should not be a measure for this year's case because last year's decision came on the back of a wages pause during the global financial crisis. This year's case comes on the back of a record increase. If you combine last year's increase with what we're saying should be the increase this year, working people would get around about the rate of increase in the cost of living through the wages tribunal. And of course, this year's increase doesn't substitute for last year's increase. They all apply at the same time. So we think that's reasonable. And what's critical here is that the tribunal is not just fair for the people who are working in businesses, but also the people who are running those businesses and trying to make ends meet as well.
But also fair for a lot of Australians who are on the minimum wage. Many of them would argue that $9 extra a week or so isn't enough to cover cost of living increases, high utility prices, the very real possibility of more interest rate rises over the next 6 months.
Well, that's right, Michael, and that's where these cases are very difficult judgments to make because it equally doesn't help those people if their working hours get reduced because the increase is too severe. And what we're really saying to the tribunal is you need to make sure first and foremost that you're not putting jobs at risk and jobs pressure at risk because that won't help anybody. And once you get over that threshold, I think you recognise in this year's case with the type of economy we have where the mining boom is not lifting all boats, that we need to have a much more modest outcome.
In terms of when we're looking at almost full employment, is there not a lot of pressure, even on those small and medium-sized businesses though, to up wages because they want the best stuff they can get?
There's some wages pressure like that, and that's a really good point. That's why we actually don't need the tribunal to make such a heavy decision this year because we are finding wages pressures, and some of those businesses, when they lose a staff member and have to employ a new staff member, are already having to pay a higher wage rate than they previously were paying because of the wages pressure in the economy. There are people who are moving towards some of the higher earning occupations because of the way our economy has this fast and slow lane. So we actually don't need the wages tribunal to impose a really blunt instrument across all small and medium businesses for people to get wage increases because there are still some wage movements in the economy.
And you're confident in the system as it is that it does just really work through all those issues because they are complex the way our economy is running at the moment.
Well, it's not an ideal system. Having well-meaning people in office towers in Melbourne and Sydney make these decisions that affect, tens of thousands of businesses and working people. It's a very blunt instrument. It's a bit like the Reserve Bank in introducing an interest rate decision. It affects people with some counterproductive consequences if they do get it wrong. But we have to put the case, and I think that the tribunal does its very best to make a judgment and has to exercise the wisdom of Solomon. And we want to make sure that they apply a modest increase this year.
I'm sure you do. Good answer. Thank you.
Thank you.